Famous University 2, or FU2, as we call it here internally. It's so bad. We have a partnership with Stanford, and the T-shirts say "FU Stanford." It's terrible.
Nice.
Perfect.
Well, at least your Angular directives are FA.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. So we're going to kick off today's episode with an announcement. The Web Platform Podcast will be a sponsor for the DC Google Developer Group event, DevFest 2014. And that's devfestdc.org if you want information about it, you want to buy tickets. It's through Eventbrite, and it's very inexpensive. So AOL is hosting the event at their headquarters in Dulles, Virginia on November 21st, and that's from 9 to 5, maybe even 8:30, I think you can get there. But this year, DevFest will have sessions and code labs on Android, Google Glass, wearables, AngularJS, Google Cloud Platform, and many others. So the Web Platform Podcast hosts, Danny Blue and myself, are going to be running a Polymer code lab and a short intro to web components and Polymer presentation. So check for updates, volunteer, or buy tickets at the site, or you can go to the DC Google Developer Group's website, which is gdgdc.com, and that is also built with Polymer. So check it out. And that's devfestdc.org or gdgdc.com. All right, so on with the show. This is episode 17 of the Web Platform Podcast. Your hosts today are myself, Eric Isaacson, UX engineer at 3Pillar Global, and Danny Blue, front-end engineer at Deloitte Digital.
Hey, everybody.
We are joined today with Steve Newcomb. Steve Newcomb is defender of magic, wizardry, and the web, and also CEO of Famous. Famous is a free open-source JavaScript framework that helps you create smooth, complex UIs for any screen. They've done some interesting work in the education space using their Famous University, and they're also working with Angular and other frameworks to help build a better web. As far as titles go, I really prefer the defender of magic, wizardry, and the web over CEO, but that is just my humble opinion.
Hey, guys. Great to be here.
So there's a lot of JavaScript frameworks out there. So what is the one thing that really differentiates Famous from the other libraries that are out there? Why would developers use your framework?
Well, the one thing that makes Famous unique is back when Mark and I started the company, we would use other people's HTML5 dev platforms, and we always had this situation where we would play with a demo and be like super duper excited, and then you go to build something real, and slowly but surely everything falls apart, and the performance starts to get volatile, and then you just start pulling all your hair out. We were attempting to build something that looks a lot like modern-day Facebook in HTML5, and we would get that first page in and the first few buttons to switch between the slides, and everything would look great, and then we would hook it up to live data, and then just everything would fall apart. And then we would just switch to a new framework, have all this promise in the beginning, and then it would fall apart all over again. And we got so frustrated that we actually told our investors we have to give up on our startup idea. And Mark and I are both platform people, so we just decided to really take a look at the engineering bits of things and get into the details of it. So we looked at the browser and realized that it has two fundamental flaws in it that we wanted to correct. One is that the rendering engine inside of it is designed to render a text document with links, and we're asking it to render an app. So that's a very hard thing to do. It's kind of the wrong tool for the job. And then the second thing we noticed that the animation engine in the browser, which is CSS3, is a very weak animation engine. It can handle very basic animations, maybe roughly equivalent to like the late 80s in gaming, if you think of it that way. And we were studying a study about JavaScript to find out how fast JavaScript had become. And we looked at the way that the rendering engine, or the layout engine rather, in the browser was failing. And it fails as a result of complexity. That's why we say complex UIs for any screen. And what happens is The browser is meant to handle static layouts or very lightweight layouts that don't change a lot. So when you're thinking about the DOM tree inside of the browser, if it stays relatively constant, a browser is going to do a very, very good job of that. But if it's constantly changing, so you have a single web page design where you're injecting stuff, the browser degrades very poorly as it tries to deal with that complexity. So as the complexity of your DOM tree goes up, and as your complexity of your needs within that tree goes up, the browser fails very inelegantly. And so we wanted to create a way that you are managing the render tree wisely in a virtual DOM in JavaScript, and then posting to the most optimized DOM tree at the last moment, so that you basically circumvent the layout engine in the browser. And then what we do is we post that very flat optimized DOM tree to the browser, and then inject matrix 3D attributes so that we absolutely position each div in the DOM tree. So a lot of people think that our performance gain comes from the fact that we use matrix 3D. But the fact that we use matrix 3D is just that it's sort of like an API to the GPU. What really gives us the benefit is that the CPU-bound activity of creating matrices, multiplying matrices, and arriving at a composite matrix, which the browser does very poorly for app type of apps, we do very wisely in JavaScript, and then we just inject the matrix 3D at the end. And that's the layout engine. The second thing that we did was looked at animation, and animations in CSS3 are done with simple transitions and simple curves. And you get a problem that your animations don't feel natural, they don't feel quite right. Have you guys ever tried to create a bounce in CSS3, a proper bounce at the end of a scroll view?
Only with keyframes.
Yeah, with the keyframes for sure.
Right, and so there's really three ways to do it. There's Bezier curves or curves, but then Safari has a problem that it can't really go past 0 wisely. So then you go to keyframe animations. But keyframe animations have a problem is they can't be interrupted wisely. You're sitting there replacing classes, and what you get is non-performant injections, and then the keyframe creates a hard-coded bounce. So that the size of the bounce is not related in any way to how hard you're throwing the scroll view in any way. And so we decided to create a 3D physics engine in JavaScript to be appended to the layout engine wisely. So we basically looked at iOS and noticed it uses a physics engine, Box 2D, and we looked at console gaming engines such as Unreal 4 and Unity 3D, and they all use 3D physics engines. So we were like, hey, JavaScript is super fast these days. Why not build both a layout engine and a 3D physics engine, take it out of the role where it's no longer the role of the browser to do that, put it in the role of JavaScript, and instead of it being a black box, make it open source and let everybody make that better. And the first time we tried a little study with it, we were 14 times faster than the default layout engine in Chrome. And we were like, wow, we really have something here. And that was 3.5 years ago. Where the rubber hits the road can be combined something like this. If you're thinking about a scroll view, that's, let's say, like a news feed, and you have many news feed items in an infinite scroll view. To do an infinite scroll view wisely, where you're throwing the scroll view and you're pulling in new data, you need in the neighborhood of around 150 news items in memory at any given time. And if you think of those news items as consolidation of a bunch of what we call surfaces or divs, you need about 150 divs to be able to do that. A browser in that scenario poops out at around 40 divs. You start seeing massive volatility in performance. Even if you're doing the most optimized DOM reuse strategy possible, around 40 divs you start seeing volatility is the better word rather than saying speed slowed down. It's more correct to say that your frame rates become volatile. Famous taps out in DOM at around 500 surfaces. And so you just have a lot more room when you're wisely managing the render tree. So we're kind of the only framework out there that has our own 3D layout engine integrated with our own 3D physics engine. And so anytime you're evaluating an HTML5 platform to use, one of the very early questions you should ask yourself is, does that platform rely on the internal browser layout engine and animation engine? If it does, you're going to tap out around 40 surfaces before you start seeing volatility in heavy flow. If it does have its own layout engine and physics engine, then you'll be at more around 500 surfaces. And both of those numbers are getting better as time goes by. But again, you really won't be able to render something like Facebook in HTML5. It's one of the reasons why Facebook pulled out of HTML5, because they saw a long, protracted road before they're going to nail that scroll view in Facebook.
So Ionic is a big framework, a big front-end framework that people use, especially on mobile. It sounds like a lot of, even for Famous, a lot of the focus is on mobile performance rather than just the desktop performance. But so something like Ionic that uses the browser's native DOM structure is inherently going to be more limited compared to using something like Famous that does it all on its own.
Yeah, Ionic is very inspiring for how easy it is to set up a template and how easy it is to prototype. But Ionic does use the internal animation engine in the browser, and it does use the internal layout engine in the browser. So you will hit those performance limitations, especially on Android, doing that strategy. But I do find that Ionic does heavily inspire me to help make Famous easier. So I'd say that Famous has a higher top end, a significantly higher top end, but Ionic is significantly easier to get up and running and to use right now.
The virtual DOM that you're using and you're building up, it seems similar to React.js and Elm when they compile everything. In fact, probably closer to Elm because you're doing HTML and CSS as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hunt who was doing a lot of great work over at Facebook React. I remember the first time he came over to Famous because we've done an integration project with Facebook React. And it was awesome because it felt like we were finishing each other's sentences. We really viewed the idea of creating a virtual tree and managing it ourselves wisely as being core. So I think we're going to see a trend going in that direction. I'm really impressed with Facebook React.
As far as the framework goes, I've been looking through the GitHub. I see that it's been compared to Ionic like you spoke about, but it's very different if you look at the code. You're using require.js, it seems like, out of the box for the different modules. If I'm mistaken, let me know. There's a lot of different modules and there's a lot of good documentation on them, but it seems very vanilla JavaScript, not too much magic at the single JavaScript file level. So it's kind of nice to be able to go through that and see. And I was very surprised that it looks like you're not using Webgl in there. And I think people have spoken about, when they speak about what you guys are doing with Famous, it's like, oh, they must be using Webgl or some other technology. And that would be, something not CPU intensive, but GPU intensive.
So we just released 0.3 in our GitHub repo. And one of the things we did in there was, I'm a big fan of letting people use your platform the way they want to use it. And what we were getting is a lot of complaints from the jQuery folks that were trying to convert from jQuery over to Famous or from Bootstrap over to Famous, because those folks aren't used to a require or AMD style. They're used to a global namespace. And so if you look at the new Git repo that we just put out there, you can actually look at the folder structure of it now, and instead of being like a folder structure that looks really scary to like a jQuery developer, our folder structure looks a lot like Bootstrap now. We actually were heavily inspired in the simplicity of how Bootstrap's folder structure was. And if you look, we're now converted over to almost identical to Bootstrap. But what's different from us and Bootstrap is that you can use Famous now in the global namespace if you want. So if you're a jQuery developer, you can just say famous dot and then just go ahead and start coding. You don't need any server environment. You don't need grunt serve. You don't need anything. You can just open up the files and go, just like jQuery and Bootstrap.
And that's new in version 3?
Yeah, that's new in version 0.3. Yeah, I wish we were in version 3. But if you are a person that loves modular style programming, you can use require to its nth degree. And it's kind of nifty because it just knows which one you're doing and then works with you. And then the way we've built out Famous is that we're going to be building a build process so that you can just build at the end, and it only requires in the components of Famous that you need, so you get a bare minimum footprint in your build process. So we've seen people create full apps with a footprint as low as 40 KB.
Wow. Danny was just saying before we got on with you that he was using a browserify version.
Yeah.
which was pretty cool, I thought.
Yeah, we had a team do a browserify implementation of Famous, and we love it. A lot of people here use it still. We internally use the more advanced forms of Famous. Nobody here internally uses global namespace, but it is helpful if you want to do like CodePen demos or JS Fiddle demos and things like that.
For the events, there's surface events, program events, and engine events. Probably not as exciting as some of the other features, but can you go through those just to get an idea of what those are?
Well, the way we want to handle our eventing is almost to be normal, to do eventing in a way that people come into it and they say, oh, this feels familiar. So there's only certain areas where we want to do like reinvent the wheel and do things like completely different. And in many, many other areas like eventing and piping, whether we're doing pub sub, whatever model that we're using, we wanted that to be familiar and not abnormal. We're still playing around with that. We're actually building in mixed mode, which comes after 0.3. We're working on that all over again to make it even simpler than it is currently.
Nice. As far as the rendering engine you have the physics engine, so the rendering being the layout. And you spoke like a year ago at, I forget which conference it was, but it was, what was it, 3D Physics for Dummies?
Yeah.
Which is a great title.
Thank you. We're very proud of that.
You spoke about two other engines that you were working on. A
Yep.
gesture engine, which looks like it's complete based on the tutorials I saw inside of the university, and the multi-screen engine. Can you talk about those?
Really, there's three sort of big ones in there, and there's mixed mode, which is going to integrate Webgl into Famous, and that's currently sort of the main sprints that we're on right now. Next will be, as you mentioned, will be multi-screen. We can use sockets to enable people to have one app project out to N screens with about a 10 to 20 millisecond delay. And the idea here is you can use Famous with Node or sockets to really do second screen experiences or multi-screen experiences in a way that's significantly easier than it currently is to do that. So we already have some demos of multi-screen where we have a scroll view that can go in full 3D across any number of screens. And there's actually even a couple videos out there where we put two screens near each other at any angle, and then we can actually flick an object from one screen and flick it into the other screen with 3D physics.
That's pretty cool.
That's a definite thing that I could nerd out on all day long. That is currently right now, I would say, where mixed mode, which is WebGL, is getting into near production mode. The multi-screen technology is still in a highly experimental stage, not quite alpha yet. And then we have a gesture engine, and I can actually now talk about what's behind all that. We actually now are going to be getting a patent, gesture printing. So we actually have discovered that if you let a human being use an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone, within seconds we actually can learn a lot about that person. They can be used in analytics and then be doing settings for live splits or A/B tests, and you can actually use it for different UI purposes. But we actually can tell, we believe we can tell a person if a person is left-handed, right-handed, if they're young or old, or if they're female or male, just by touching the screen.
That's some sci-fi stuff.
Not really. It actually turned out that it was because Mark and I would have our iPads there, and have you ever had an iPad that you're developing on, and your finger gook makes the screen so dirty that you can actually see where all your swipes have been? Well, we were sitting there we were trying to build a gesture where we made our fingers go around in a circle to rotate an object on the y-axis. Both Mark and I realized, based on the gook on our screens, that we were trying to draw a circle, but we were actually drawing the number 6 each time. And then we brought in a whole bunch of other people, and we recognized that women are actually capable of drawing a circle, and do. And all men cannot draw a circle. It seems like we have a lot of data. So we just took that to the nth degree and began testing all sorts of other things. Like we put a paginated scroll view in front of people, and we said, hey, just go to the next page of this scroll view. And we realized that men are like, haha, and they throw the scroll view, and women just flick it, barely. telling left-handed versus right-handed is actually very easy. Apple and Samsung already do that all day long. We can tell by the speed with which you do your gestures can be a very good indicator of how old you are. So imagine how this could affect things. Like if you realize you have a very old person on an iPad, you might slow down all of your animations so that the person has more cognitive time to actually absorb what you're trying to display. Whereas if you found out that you had like a very young 16-year-old on the iPad, maybe you'd speed up your animations slightly more than the average. So a typical animation might be in the 800 millisecond range, but to a 65, 75, 85-year-old person, that might be too much. And you might want to slow it down to about a second and a half. And then they absorb things much better and they feel better about the app. But yeah, that's what we were talking about when we were talking about our gesture engine, is not just gestures, but doing things with gestures that are really unique and making the person enjoy the experience all the more. And then imagine how much more accurate we can get with gestures. So I was talking about how when I was trying to draw a circle, I was actually just drawing the number 6. But what if we knew that? What if we knew you were a guy and you were left-handed? So we looked for an inverted 6, and we know that that meant you were trying to draw a circle, probably. If you knew these things about the person, you can actually mod your gesture recognition engine to be more accurate for that person. And the person doesn't know what's going on. They just perceive, oh my God, this app is just really cool. It's always accurate. Where other apps maybe like don't feel as good.
As far as the tests go, were those internal tests? Were they subsets, small groups? I mean, in the sense that you're taking one geographic location.
Yeah. This is small and early stage. We were over at UC Berkeley when we did this.
Right.
And again, that's it. Kind of is going to go Webgl engine first, then multi-view, then gesture type stuff.
Lots to look forward to.
Yeah, we have a long roadmap of lots of fun ahead of us.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Now, why are you guys using matrices and vectors over something like WebGL or Canvas?
When we looked at the different flavors of things you could render to on a browser, what you have is you have DOM, you have 2D Canvas, you have SVG, and you have WebGL. We kind of just look at it as use the right tool for the right job. And so when we built our rendering engine, one of the things that we didn't tell anybody that we did when we started is we abstracted it from what we rendered to. Because we just took an engineer's perspective and said, look, as an engineer, I just want to use the right tool for the right job. So if I want to render text or content and lay out text or content, I want DOM. It helps me do SEO. It's the right tool for that job. It does a very good job at laying out stuff. But if I want to do graphics, high-end fidelity 3D graphics, I want GL. If I want 2D non-square objects, I want Canvas. If I want vectorized fonts and things like that, I want SVG. And so Famous, at the end of the day, why we call mixed mode the future of Famous, is because that's where we start rendering to anything in 3D space. So when we compute the matrices and multiply them, we can do that for WebGL, or we can do it for DOM. And that's what's taken us so long in mixed mode. It's very difficult, and no one's ever really married the 3D coordinate space between DOM and WebGL before, because when you do 3D perspective with coordinate space, DOM measures it in a different method than WebGL. And it kind of makes sense that they do, because they both came from different engineering religions. WebGL is actually OpenGL, which is from the native side of rendering. And so everything is done there actually probably arguably more correctly. That's how 3D gaming engines do it, console games, that's how native does it. But DOM, on the other hand, when DOM contemplated 3D scenes, it decided not to calculate the coordinate space the same way. And so marrying DOM, what you want for SEO and content, with GL, what you want for fidelity, was a double nutter. We thought it would take us 6 to 9 months. The team that tackled it had an early breakthrough that let them finish it in about 3 months. And so we've now actually completed that marriage, and we have our first demos coming out that are mixed DOM and GL in the same coordinate space.
When should we expect that? Tomorrow.
So I believe that we'll probably be in alpha in January. With certain companies that we're closely partnered with, they're using it now. Will probably be a full beta release at our April event that we're having. So at our April event, we'll be launching mixed mode, and we'll also be launching our authoring tool, which is another big thing that hasn't been talked about much, but we're also releasing a full-blown authoring tool as well.
So an authoring tool is not it's not an easy project to do, especially when you're trying to merge the workflows of a designer and a developer. So I know there's been a lot of attempts to do this and a lot of failures. We're getting closer and closer with the tools that I've seen, like Macaw. Adobe is making some progress in this space, but I still haven't seen something that would work at that lean UX level where you're pairing with a designer and a developer. So I'm really interested personally to hear about what you're doing with this authoring tool.
When you put me and Mark together, I'm a designer/engineer, and he's an engineer/not a designer in any way, shape, or form. I always had a passion for giving designers a tool that's a lot better than Photoshop to do something real. And you take all of those no-code solutions, they generally create very low-quality production code. When you drag and drop stuff around on a screen, it generally produces what if a senior engineer looked at it, they would say that's really, really bad code. We actually built Famous for the last 4 years with the idea of eventually attaching an authoring tool to it. But all the logic, all the brains, all the thinking is actually in the platform code, and none of it will be in the authoring tool. The authoring tool will simply be almost like a skin on top of our API system. And so we're working on a design authoring tool that looks, frankly, like it came straight out of a sci-fi movie. We literally targeted like 10 sci-fi movies as inspiration for how it looks. And it's going to allow people to build websites, mobile sites, and mobile apps and widgets and things like that in a full 3D environment that is heavily inspired by Unreal 4 engine, heavily inspired by Unity 3D, and not inspired in any way, shape, or form by any web IDE that exists. It's all game-inspired and sci-fi inspired.
I like the sci-fi part. So is it almost more... So it almost sounds like that's more akin to if you were developing a native application. So like if you're developing native iOS, you have storyboards, and so it sounds like these are a little more comprehensive than what storyboards are. But that idea of like, all right, here's my UI, and now I want to, or in Unity 3D is a good example. If you have a model of your character, and then you write a script that you want to apply to that character. So is that kind of the same way that it works?
Yeah, we wanted to almost let the designer be a director and direct the scene, and then let a senior engineer and go in and do bespoke code to hook it up and do the bespoke hardcore stuff. So imagine a designer does all the design bits that creates the UI stuff. It'll auto hook up to our cloud services, but then it'll let the data side of things that always need to be bespoke and done custom. A senior engineer can go in and backfill the custom integration with the custom data. But the code that is produced from the designer's workflow is production UI code.
That in itself is impressive. Eric has probably had the same experiences I have with other tools like that people try, and usually they're just limited to prototyping, almost, right, rather than actually this is what we're going to use.
And that's because most of the prototyping tools are authoring tools just built on top of the browser, and the browser doesn't contemplate trying to write production code. So what it is those prototype authoring tools spit out code. I mean, that's their job, basically. Ours is inverted completely from that. It spits out no code. It just sets API calls. And the only way to do that, and Mark and I knew it, was to build the platform with that in mind from the get-go. And it was so funny when we met with our investors. They're like, are you going to have an authoring tool? And we're like, yes, in 4 years. Now give us money. And I feel so lucky that they trusted us. And they said, okay, we'll wait 4 years for this damn authoring tool. And we're finally at the point where Mark and I feel like the platform is strong enough to go and attach a very lightweight authoring tool that is mostly about enjoyment and loving your job as a designer. And the production code it creates has already actually been created in the platform. So this will create pristine, canonically correct, famous code. We hope to release that in April. The early looks at it are, I literally want to like throw up when I see it. It's so beautiful. I just want to do it all day long and nothing else. As a designer, of course I'm heavily influencing it, and we're building a design team out of Amsterdam, which is where some of the best designers in the world live. And so we're actually constructing this in Amsterdam, which is kind of super cool.
So it looks like a TARDIS, right?
It looks like if Iron Man became a designer. That's what I would say the interface looks like.
You're teasing us.
Well, we actually threw up a quick screenshot of it at the last meetup. So if you go through the videos that we just released the video from our last meetup, we put it up on screen for 5 seconds, and we took it away, and the audience really yelled at us.
You guys like teasing the dev community, don't you?
We do, but we've promised. We're starting to now promise that we're going to stop doing that because I've just received too many death threats. We're actually going to split our meetup now up into a meetup for demos and teasing, and then we're just going to separate all of our dev meetups into separate dev meetups where we're just coding the entire time.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, I'm going to get killed for talking about this, but we are looking at renting out IMAX theaters to do this in. So we're just going to look at going on tour throughout the United States. Every big city has a IMAX theater, right? So Mark and I are going to build
the DC area.
In DC?
Yeah.
Well, I'm from DC.
Yeah.
I grew up in Maryland, so I'm back there. So yeah.
Come on over, man.
Yeah. So yeah, Mark and I are going to build a custom computer so we can render Famous to an IMAX projector set.
Nice.
We want to just push as many pixels as we can.
Yeah, I remember I worked at a retail shop in West Nyack, New York, and we would go to the IMAX theater, and we had like trade outs with them, and so after hours we would just hook up the Xbox and play Halo on there.
Oh my God!
It was crazy.
That's insane. Yeah, I have a 110-inch TV dedicated to gaming, but that doesn't even touch an IMAX. Jeez.
So one of the criticisms developers have told me is that they're not sure about the search engine optimization, the SEO, or even the accessibility of the components inside of Famous and the framework itself. So is it SEO ready and is it accessibility ready is a big concern, and it's a concern with all JavaScript frameworks. Angular just did a giant overhaul with their accessibility. Polymer did one too. SEO is not talked about quite as much, but it's something that is concerning with all of these frameworks. So how are you guys dealing with that for Famous?
Do you guys know my background in search field?
No.
I'm the founder of a company called PowerSet, which was bought by Microsoft and became Microsoft Bing, the search engine. So I have extremely deep and painful experience in the search space. And when we built Famous, we thought about SEO from the beginning, because if you think about it, like a decade from now, I think that there's a billion websites on Earth. I actually keep track of how many websites there are. It's a website that counts them at all times, and we just went over a billion. I think over the next decade, all of these websites are going to go from being multi-page websites where there's multiple HTML files and there's links that just connect those files. I think a decade from now, every single one of those websites will be a single web page design. And if that happens, SEO breaks. SEO does not work for single web page design, and let me put a period on that. There's all sorts of black hat techniques that will eventually be sussed out and not be accepted. So any type of pre-rendering, you've heard all these pre-render techniques, or render twice, or render once to the Google bot and render a separate time to the user. I think those will eventually be seen as black hat techniques. There must be a single source of truth.
What about what Google's trying to do as far as, I don't know if they're actually doing it yet, but they did discuss that they were going to actually do their search after the tree has fully rendered from JavaScript and CSS and loaded.
Right. So Google knows that this is coming, and so they very smartly have put a ton of work into what's called deep JavaScript introspection. And that is the route everyone needs to go. Google is correct. They're going to nail it. We've seen early reports come out that look incredibly strong. We are actually now meeting with search engine folks to make sure that Famous complies with deep JavaScript introspection. We are not investing heavily in any of the black hat or brown hat techniques. Just as a search engine guy, I'm sort of like adamantly against that crap. So we are going to go with Google's method of deep JavaScript introspection. And Angular, Google's Angular is making sure that they're doing some work on this, and we can talk about Angular in a second. And then oddly, you'd think the other one that was working on this was Microsoft, but it's not. Fascinatingly, the other company working on this is Facebook. So the two companies that are teeing off to be search engine competitors, or actually the better word for in the future is called discovery, is Facebook v. Google, and I love it. So Facebook React is already done work in SEO that's actually quite impressive too. Facebook React claims that it's already fully SEOable in trials. So these are the tools that I like. Angular and React are doing some really good work in there. I'm not aware of what Ember's doing, but I think it's fascinating that Microsoft is eerily absent from this discussion.
Do you think they're absent, or do you think they're just quiet about it, kind of watching to see what everybody else is doing?
I have never claimed to understand Microsoft. I did not join when they acquired my company. I don't know anything about Microsoft. And many people ask me, and no, I use Google, I do not use Bing.
Nice.
Fair.
It's probably the oldest example of Famous that I can think of, but the periodic table that you guys did really sticks out in my mind. And I wanted to know how you guys ended up creating that, and what's the story behind it?
Oh no, me and Mark did that one.
Okay,
It took us 2 weeks, and that was the first thing that we ever did. We actually invented Famous and built periodic table in 2 weeks, mainly because we got invited to speak at the Disrupt conference, TechCrunch Disrupt, and we didn't have anything, so we had to build something. And so the pressure of that conference made us build periodic table, and it was actually inspired from Iron Man. A lot of people think it was the school teacher that sold drugs TV show.
Breaking Bad?
Yeah, they thought it was a Breaking Bad homage to that, but it was not. It was actually an homage to a scene in Iron Man. And the original periodic table had to be taken down because the movie company thought we were a little too close to the actual movie. So we had to change it so that it would be a little different from the movie. And then that's when everybody thought we were the school teacher selling drugs. Yeah, that took 2 weeks.
So I see a lot of numbers thrown at me with request animation frame, and I really want to know what this magic number is, the 16.66 milliseconds. And it seems to come up over the past few years. So could you please go through request animation frame and how this all works together with that magic number?
Well, 16.66 milliseconds calcs out to exactly 60 frames per second if you can get that solidly on every request animation frame. And what happens in HTML5, if you have the wrong layout engine, which is the browser's layout engine, you actually end up with a very volatile frame rate. So one frame, you'll get a frame rate of 16.66 milliseconds. And the very next frame rate, you'll get 500 milliseconds, or 2 frames per second. And then when you add these together, the human eye doesn't see these frames as the average of all frame rates. What actually happens is your brain degrades it way lower than average. And so you hear people saying that HTML5 has a very slow frame rate, or it doesn't have native speeds. What it actually doesn't have is native's reliability of frame rate. So if you actually do an interesting study, is if you actually did a rock solid 20 frames per second, and kept it that way every frame, that actually looks significantly more performant than if you had a very volatile frame rate that was averaging 40 frames per second.
So even in the early stages, going back to that talk that you did, 3D physics for dummies, you even said in there that your frame rate differential was less than 1 millisecond for each frame. So that's pretty amazing.
Right. So our layout engine on a MacBook, say, for example, takes in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 milliseconds to calc the matrices. The physics engine can take anywhere from 1 millisecond to the rest of the 16.66 milliseconds. You can actually break the render eventually with a physics engine, especially if you're doing collision detection to non-circular objects. So it just depends on how much of the physics engine you're using. But a really neat rule of thumb is you have 16.66 milliseconds in the render loop. You need to be rock solid with your reliability. But you can add feature sets on to your engine as long as you stay under 16.66 milliseconds. So if you wanted to add on multi-screen, for example, we always calc, well, how much of the 16.66 are we eating up by adding that to it? So any feature we add, we're always trying to make sure we stay under that 16.66 milliseconds so that we stay rock solid. But in truth, you can go all the way down to 40 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and what's much more important is you stay reliably constant and not be volatile. And it's virtually impossible for the browser to not be anything other than volatile. And that's why we don't rely on the layout engine in the browser.
Have things changed significantly since then? Like, has Famous gotten much better even than that since then?
With Webgl, yes. For example, we give ourselves a fidelity rating here internally with our own. There were no such things as benchmark tests in this field when we started, so we had to invent some. So one of the things we do is we invent a fidelity score. So for example, HTML5 by itself gets a fidelity score of about 50. Famous, in its DOM version, which is our 0.3.0 version of Famous, gets a fidelity score of 500. Famous mixed mode, we just did our first fidelity rating on it, 1.5 million. So it's not a little bit better. I told everybody in the company, mixed mode's it, drop everything. This is laughable. We will be able to render in the future Halo that's search engine optimizable in Famous.
And that's not even without optimized JavaScript through ASM or anything. That's pretty crazy.
Well, that would even make it better. Those types of things are unfortunately, many of those things are only usable in some browsers and not all. So I try to look for solutions that are usable everywhere. But it's only going to get better after that.
So with everything you're doing in optimization, utilizing the CPU and doing all these awesome things, what is the target browser matrix or device matrix or screen matrix even that you would suggest for Famous based on your experiences in your labs or wherever you're testing this?
Right. This is probably one of our greatest challenges. So I'm always, and I'm actually currently writing the FAQ for the new website, and I'm addressing this exact question. So we're only 0.3. We haven't had time to do any polyfills or backfills yet at all. Let me tell you where not to use Famous. And my investors probably want to kill me for doing this, but the engineer inside just wants to say, don't do this with Famous. If you're building a 3D interface, I would not expect it to work on Microsoft unless you're a super senior engineer and know how to build your own polyfills. You can do it. We can do it here internally, and it's tough. And the reason is because there's a bug in the way that Microsoft handles Preserve 3D. It doesn't map 3D coordinate space properly with perspective. If you're doing a 2D interface, yes, you can get Microsoft to work just fine. We hope, and I don't want to spill the beans, we hope Microsoft will be pleased to announce something quite soon.
More teasing.
I know. They are going to fix Preserve 3D. It's publicly known that they are now actively working on that bug, and it's in testing mode of a fix. So that's really good. I would always rather my animation engine and my layout engine to not be a black box controlled by 3 companies. It's as simple as that. It's the reason why you don't see jQuery embedded in a browser, because we wanted to keep it open source. We wanted to keep it in the hands of JavaScript developers. JavaScript for things like matrices and calculating matrices is 80% as fast as compiled C. There's no longer the great advantage of having those things in C that there used to be. So if that advantage isn't actually there, then why would we cede that power to somebody other than us? I hope the browser companies don't kill me for saying that, but I would rather have my own animation engine that I control.
And that's the beauty of open source, right? There's so much that we can do and so many different directions we can go. So if somebody wanted to use a different type of layout engine or rendering engine, they could do that. And they could fork Famous and build something else. So, if somebody came along and did something, maybe that worked for Famous, would you consider doing something else inside of Famous? Or do you think you guys have it down where this is it?
Yeah, so things like, should I use a CSS engine to do animation? Would I ever use Polymer? My answer is no. I would just rather build all of that stuff myself.
So with that said, do you feel like web components in general have a really good place to interact with Famous? Or do you feel like it's sort of two different ways of thinking about, rendering inside of the browser?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that Mark and I are super proud of is that there's all these things that exist in the web world that are sort of componentized and black boxed, and you want them to be, right? The concept of a form, like that's fine to be in the browser and just tap a form and a button and things like that. So one of the rules with Famous that's super duper cool is anything that's a child of a Famous surface follows the normal rules of the web. So if you want to put a video, a form, a Polymer component, anything you want as a child of as a Famous surface, it will operate as normal, which is fantastic. So those that love Polymer and want to just use it for speed can, but those who want to build their bespoke components themselves can go use Famous to build bespoke components. So I always want to provide the best of both worlds and like get out of the way of a senior engineer, but amplify a junior engineer.
So let's talk about Angular for a second. So Famous seems like a big advocate of Angular, and that's kind of surprising considering a lot of people would think that Famous is a competitor directly with Angular. So can you talk about the Angular directives that you guys have created and the mashup of the two frameworks that you have? I went through the university that you have at famo.us, and it's pretty awesome. You have some really good, easy tutorials that developers can go through. We'll put that in the show notes. So definitely let's talk about Angular and tell us all about the relationship between Famous and Angular.
Sure. We dedicate about a little over $250,000 a year to the Angular integration internally. I actually have the Angular team sit right outside of my office. It's that important to me. And we are investing heavily in Angular because we're just seeing it kind of dominate the MVC space. And so we've put a lot of effort into integrating with Angular. And one of the things that I'm really proud to say is that Brad, who heads up Angular at Google, just announced in Europe at the NGConf in Europe that we're going to be the super framework for Angular when they hit Angular 2.0. So I love the integration between Angular currently and Famous, but that's Angular 1. Whatever and Famous 0.3. What I'm really excited about is Famous mixed mode with Angular 2.0, because then you get React-style programming with Famous mixed mode. And I think that's when you'll just see it's like kind of a little bit like game over. Like that's a great way to do stuff. We just did a joint meetup with Angular at Google. From what Brad tells me, it was the largest meetup that Angular has ever had in their history. So we see a long and fruitful relationship with Angular. We really get along with them. We really think similarly. I see lots of good stuff there.
When Angular 2 actually gets released in whenever, do you feel like that the landscape of the browsers at that point will be good enough for mixed mode?
The browser landscape's good enough to handle mixed mode now.
Okay.
I just think the Famous Angular marriage is really strong.
Angular and Famous seem to make a lot of sense because Famous is the view layer. Right. of your application for the most part, and Angular kind of gives you those data bindings and that like you're saying, that MVC style of development that so many people like now. So I'm a little bit curious about how your all's marriage with React works, because React, you're both kind of the same layer. So how do they work together?
Yeah, what's fascinating is the integration project with Angular took 3 months to get it nailed and to get it to pass code review because it was difficult, a very complex integration. The integration project with React took Pete Hunt and Mark, I think, 3 hours. It was just all we really had to do was decide who was the master and who was the controller in certain areas. And then once you came to agreement on that, then you're just like, oh, it's just so super easy. There are many similarities in the way that we thought about things. And I would say that it's one of the easiest integrations that a senior engineer could do. It's almost not even worth having like an official website to support it, because any senior engineer doing React could integrate the two without examples. It's just so darn easy, because you're just deciding who's master, who's controller in certain situations. You can really only have one person controlling request animation frame at a time. That's the touch point. But it's a very small surface area on the API integration with React, so it was very easy, where the surface area with Angular was quite large.
So libraries like Polymer do a pretty good job of providing tools for responsive web design. So RWD for short. And this is pretty deliberate on their part, because they know that people are starting at that mobile level, and a lot of the frameworks are moving that way. Angular, obviously, in 2.0 will be mobile. We have Brick from Mozilla, which is mobile-centric. And Famous is mobile-centric, but I don't see any tools for doing media queries and changing layouts and doing RWD type of design. Is there plans to do that, or are developers kind of on their own right now, throw in what you can and do what you can?
I think you'll just see that becomes our primary point of existence at the end of the day. We are going to be releasing an entire library of widgets and templates. So we're rebuilding all of jQuery's widgets over again, and we're rebuilding all of Twitter Bootstrap and Famous. And then we're going to release those in a way that they seamlessly integrate with each other and play well with each other. And that'll all be sort of wrapped into using an authoring tool to integrate with all of that. And in our last meetup, we teased everybody by showing them what a carousel, a simple carousel, looks like in Famous in mixed mode. And we were able to, in real time, apply lighting, apply any sort of video effect live as the video is playing in a 3D carousel. We could actually turn the images in the carousel or the videos in the carousel into cloth. You could actually set what materials everything is made out of. You could set the mass, you could set its positiveness, its negativeness, how much it repels the other objects around it. The amount of stuff that you can do in a Famous carousel versus a jQuery carousel is so much fun to see. We actually had the president of jQuery Foundation on stage, and we kind of showed the old carousel versus the Famous carousel. Both were jQuery plugin, and it was just, I mean, everybody that does jQuery was like, oh my god, I want that carousel right now. And then we're like, and you cannot have it.
So that actually brings up, is Famous all or nothing? So you've talked quite a bit about Bootstrap components and about jQuery plugins. But so what if somebody has like I said, they want that carousel and they really want to use it? Would it be possible to say, like, okay, I just want to use this carousel that's been written in Famous and plug it into my existing web page?
Yeah, I mean, so I know that we're a front-end company, but Mark and I are actually heavily inspired by back-end companies too. And all of our investors in Famous are the same investors in a company called Docker. And so we've gotten to know what the magic of Docker is, from early on, and we love the idea of making things very portable with containers. They, of course, focus on the back end. And even beyond that, I'm so fascinated with containers, I'm even an investor in a company called Sandstorm that I think that you guys will see coming out next. And that's going to be a big container company on the back end as well. And Mark and I sat down one day and we're like, when new technology comes out, it's so often that the new technology company requires you to ditch everything you've ever done and go greenfield. And that's really hard for a lot of developers to do. You've put so much time and energy in whatever the project you were working on. It's very hard to say okay, I'm going to delete everything and just start over. Because how many times have people asked you to do that? And you're like, well, it'll be a matter of months before I'm asked to do it all over again. We, for about 6 months, played around with the idea of how could we create a front-end container that allows you to upgrade either your desktop website, your mobile website, or your mobile app in a way that lets you keep your legacy code or whatever code you've built already and invested a lot of time and effort in. And we're like, what if you could upgrade your UI layer plus your back-end cloud one widget at a time? And so let's say you just had this one sort of money shot widget, like a carousel or slider on your website, or there was this one interaction on your iPad app that just made all the difference in the world. What if you could just say, hey, just for that box, could I have a 3D physics engine, 3D layout engine, and have Famous just live right there, but let maybe jQuery Bootstrap live around it? And so we've now successfully done that. And what's beautiful is we've hooked into that, without an iframe, the ability to have back-end cloud services that are also massively upgraded cloud services backing that widget, such as real-time live split A/B testing, analytics that includes gesture analytics and things like that. All sorts of, imagine every cloud service that you could imagine, because we've seen so many companies that have put a lot of work and time into their website, mobile site, and mobile app, but it's now 2 years old, and their cloud is now 2 years old. So they have an old A/B testing system, they have an old analytics system, and they don't want to go through some massive replatforming project to get the benefits of that. And we sort of are coming to them and saying, well, what if you could just upgrade not only your UI, but your cloud one widget at a time? We're getting a lot of traction for that. And again, the containers are married to mixed mode. So that would be an April release with containers. So it'd be containers, cloud services, mixed mode, and the authoring tool is April.
So I think these are amazing technologies that you're working with. You have mixed mode, you have your authoring tool, and your front-end containers. And working at a place like 3Pillar, where we focus on product development and delivering purposeful engineering, as we call it here, where we want to make sure that we're not just delivering code, that we're delivering a product that is usable and purposeful for their business. A lot of times you'll have corporations and larger companies that have browser matrices that are, IE9, IE8. You'll have old Android. Sometimes they still need to support old phones, different types of tablets that aren't really new, that have been out for 5 years or so. So it's kind of frustrating, and there's a lot of overhead in developing these fixes for the different older browsers. So if we were able to, and I don't know what you're doing with these front-end containers, obviously, but if we were able to take a technology like Docker and port it to the front end and have these front-end containers that contain everything, including some runtime where everything works consistently, that would be pretty exciting. I mean, it could be a total flop. We could have something magical happen where we have some standards behind this and it's open source, and that's pretty amazing too. So it is very intriguing. If we were able to do that, then we could provide this high quality for even the lowest common denominator and not have to depend on the browser engines. Now, again, I don't know how you're building these front-end pieces, but that is pretty alluring for a front-end developer especially.
Yeah, and we're tying this all into a pseudo GitHub structure on the back end, so that as you create widgets, as you mod widgets, as you have creations that you're proud of, you can save that either into a private account or a publicly shared hub account. And we're actually going to create a developer marketplace for people to share all of their creations with each other.
That was going to be my next question, is if because there are things like that for web components now. There have been these marketplaces for jQuery plugins. So so you're trying to make like the NPM of Famous widgets.
Yeah, imagine NPM meets CodePen. So we've rebuilt CodePen from the bottom to top so that you can have code with a live preview right next to it. The first incantation of that is actually Famous University. We're now doing Famous University 2 or FU2. And the first container, we actually Famous University within a container, so that you can now teach Famous University classes on any blog, any website, anywhere in the world, but you can OAuth into it and get credit for taking the class. And then what we've backed each of those container lessons with is each of the lessons are actually stored in Git. So no matter where those lessons exist, we can update all lessons to be on the current version of Famous by simply updating the Git repo, and then it automatically propagates out to all containers that exist in the world. And that's kind of cool. And then we're going to start, and you'll hear some announcements soon, we're giving away the Famous University infrastructure for free so that people can teach anything using Famous University. I hope to have some announcements in January on who's doing that.
It seems like you guys are really dedicated to making sure that you share that you are open source, that you try to make other people better.
Source visible to me is so darn important because I don't have an engineering degree. I learned the hard way. I right-clicked, viewed source, and then was curious. I just went from there and learned. And so being able to stare at source code and learn from it is how I learn. And I love to learn anonymously. I don't enjoy going to classes. I'm an introvert. I don't enjoy human beings. So I enjoy being alone in my hovel, with a very large screen in a dark room and learn. It's my dream to allow people to do that. That's a weird dream. I just want people to be able to learn any way that they are comfortable learning and not feel intimidated by classrooms, because I definitely am and don't like classrooms. And to me, Famous University providing a way to sit at your desk and learn by yourself without anybody watching you is what I want.
I feel like I hear FU2 all the time.
Well, yeah, we need to maybe look at rebranding the name. I don't know.
No, I think go straight to merchandising and T-shirts and be done with it.
Yeah. I would buy it just for the name. That's great.
We are looking at printing up T-shirts, but then our HR department is like, maybe not.
So we talked a lot about a lot of different things. You've made some crazy, awesome announcements. Is there anything that we missed?
If you see mixed mode demos or announcements, watch those closely. When they finally turned on JavaScript by default on all the browsers in 05, I think it was turned on, then they turned it off for security reasons, then they turned it back on in 05. It basically created the language of JavaScript and made it real, made it have this opportunity to be a big language. I don't know how the press missed it, but all the browsers 4 months ago turned WebGL on by default. And nobody said boo, except for me and Mark, which were doing jumping jacks. And I think this is going to be the biggest deal that the internet has seen since the inception of the internet. Everybody on earth talks about how it's the web versus native, and there's this big fight and who's going to win. And I think what people are going to eventually realize that there's no battle at all. They're going to get married. Because WebGL is OpenGL, which is what powers iOS devices. I think the biggest story on the web right now is that really the web and native are about to get married. They're not at war. And you're going to see these native techniques used in rendering, and they're going to get married with web techniques. So when you hear mixed mode or hear any story about mixing WebGL with DOM, that's the story I'd read every sentence of like 3 times, because that's a big deal.
So yeah, WebGL, I remember when I first heard about it, it was 10 years ago. 2004, I was teaching a class on 3D Studio Max, and I happened to read an article that just had mentioned that this was starting to be ported into the browser. And I couldn't believe it. If you can imagine at that time what the state of the browsers were, you can understand. So now, 10 years later, bam, it's here. So that's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing indeed. So back to Famous. Steve, could you please tell us how people can contact you, how they can find you, and learn more about Famous and learn more about the amazing stuff that you guys are doing at Famous?
My Twitter handle is @SteveNewcomb. Well, my email is just steve@famous, and lots of people email me directly. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which honestly is a little bit more marketing than it is dev stuff, and we're switching that over soon to be a little bit more developer related. If anybody is in the Bay Area, we have up to 40 seats here internally that we offer free office space and free food to people that want to come into Famous Labs and just learn how to code super fast in Famous and get a jump start. So a lot of startups live with us. Even some of the bigger companies come and send 5 people at a time to live with us in Famous Labs. It's sort of a super lean startup method. Those are super cool ways to learn about Famous, and then come to a Famous meetup and you'll see and learn more about Famous. And we've just started to do all-day training sessions. We just did the first 2 and we did it, a introductory course to the Famous platform, and then an advanced course to the Famous platform. And we had over 100 students in each one of those classes. So we're trying to just give people access in every way we can.
So with labs, are you planning on doing any developer previews or having developers come in and work on stuff, remote pairing, anything like that?
That's what we do in labs. So we allow people that join our labs to have access to mixed mode now.
Nice.
And we'll do everything from hackathons, and the idea is if there's something wrong, well, the engineer who built it is right upstairs. So they just come upstairs, and then every single Thursday we have a demo day at the office at 5 p.m. and we invite the public. So we've had demo days with as many as 100 people here.
All right, well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate you guys, you coming on, talking about Famous.
Yeah, Eric and I could sit here and listen to you tell us more about Famous probably for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Well, I could too. I just feel like the luckiest guy in the world to have this job. I'm glad I work here now because I don't think they'd hire me. Everybody here is way smarter than me.
That's a terrifying thought.
Well, I'm really glad to be on here and really glad to just share the news. I think this stuff is really important for JavaScript developers everywhere.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Take care,
All
guys.
right, guys. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thank you so much, Steve.
Okay, bye-bye.
This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.